The Kremlin is following in the footsteps of the coup. Putin delivers a crushing blow to the army's generals. Putin has made an unprecedented move toward the generals he believes will depose him. Putin's personal archives have been made public. The army's position in Russia has fundamentally changed as a result of this move. Putin, who has declared a state of emergency, has also been linked to the deaths of numerous opposition oligarchs. Putin chose to plan a highly significant operation in Russia's domestic affairs during the combative days of the Russian-Ukraine war, not because of his successive failures. Putin, who made this decision in response to widespread dissatisfaction with his recent failed administration, felt he was in a bind. His decision to thwart a coup by the generals following calls for revolt from numerous locations stunned the entire world. The Russian army has a structure that dates back to the Soviet Union, when it was the world's second most powerful army. But like every mismanaged army, although having the required strength on its own, is unable of taking even the smallest step in the fight. The fact that Ukrainian soldiers battle with higher organizational skills and morale provides them a significant advantage over the Russian army. Despite this advantage, Putin is still planning many more operations that will send Russian men to their deaths. This position, on the other hand, began to enrage the army's generals who want Putin's power to alter, notwithstanding his failures in many economic and sociological areas have already taken action and major problems have emerged in the Kremlin. When the Kremlin issued a red warning, it turned out that Putin and the generals on his side were drafting new plans. However, the idea of a coup was not novel. It was only recently that things began to deteriorate in Russia as a whole. There are no institutions or organizations that have not been impacted by Putin's mismanagement. However, a large number of protesters have begun to take to the streets. Putin retaliated by mobilizing his national army, often known as his personal army, because he distrusts the military. This army of 340,000 people was unleashed on the populace and protests were brutally suppressed, too. Immediately following this incident, voices from the army began to rise in protest because the security of those people was overlooked. These cries were heard just at the start of the First World War. However, Putin has modified the duty zones, declaring that all of those generals will be transferred to a more democratic administration. Putin devised a devilish scheme to halt all possible institutions within the army. Generals who might rebel against him were at the heart of this plot. Putin had them mark all soldiers who resisted him and his policies. The archives confirmed that these soldiers were going to be slain in preparation for the slightest coup against him. Putin's plans for this troop were far more fluid when Russia launched a heated conflict such as the Ukrainian conflict. As a result, Russia has lost a considerable number of generals since the start of the war. One of the key reasons Russia had a high military level was that it provided excellent training to its rank-and-file soldiers. It was extremely beneficial to the Russian army, especially when retired generals were raised in accordance with Soviet military norms. They also had free will, which allowed them to rebel against an undemocratic government based on their thoughts. This predicament compelled Putin to choose between escalating his deception in the conflict and retaining power. Putin, of course, chose power in order to avoid being tried later, and the KGB then initiated a very serious operation involving rank-and-file soldiers. Putin invited retired generals and others with significant power to the assignment one by one. While this situation surprised people all across the world, at first it was projected that he would profit from his experience. But nothing ever goes as planned, according to the archives. These generals were expressly deployed to the front lines of the heated war by Putin. A journalist named Dmitry, who was attempting to expose them in the Russian press at the time, was found dead the next morning at his house. Major General Konomi Beresheva was one of the first victims of Putin's diabolical agenda. Bochev, who achieved great success in the Russian Air Force, retired from the Russian army 10 years ago. Following his retirement, He was one of the generals called to duty when the war began, but no one could have imagined that he would die so quickly. But it was probable that Putin wanted to get rid of it because it was referenced in archive papers and Russia had faced major difficulties during the Ukrainian war. To avoid drawing the attention of the generals, Putin had to come up with an alternative cover. He perished in this manner on the front lines of the battle. It is also required to create some information on this, despite the fact that there were numerous wars up until 2014, only one general was killed. In other words, this is not a mistake to make in this conflict, especially with an army like Russia's, which is touted as the world's second largest. This validates the information provided by the archives when they first emerge. Immediately following this incident, Major General Andrei Mordovich, Putin's right-hand man, was shot and killed by a sniper. The fact that such important generals were killed one by one demonstrated once again that Putin was working on a serious plan. The truly shocking charge, however, was made in reference to Sergei Surovikin, the former commander of the Ukrainian front. Sergei Surovikin, the commander, was promptly fired. The reason for this is because while it is expressed as Russia's failed attacks following each other, the problem was completely different. Retired generals and active duty figures who intended to stage a coup in Russia joined up with Sergei Surovikin to form a coup team. The only reason Sergei Surovikin could not be executed was because to Wagner, the Russian army's most useful group in active warfare at the time, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the founder of Wagner, has often stood next to Sergei Surovikin. Surovikin, who is nearly untouchable under his protection, could make whatever moves he wanted and was now establishing his own dominance inside the army. This infuriated Putin. Putin quickly picked Valery Gerasimov, his chief of staff, whom he greatly trusts, to replace him. However, the other generals were killed because they did not want Putin. It was widely known that the generals planning the coup sought to usher in a completely new regime in Russia. The president would be replaced and, as expected, Prigozhin, viewed as a challenger to Putin, would take the helm. Putin, who was aware of this, could not keep his voice quiet because he was currently winning one or two fronts thanks to Prigozhin's army. However, it was already disclosed through the archives that he assassinated highly powerful oligarchs in order to put sanctions on Europe. Approximately 11 oligarchs died as a result of simple accidents and unexplained reasons. These were the names that possessed the most natural gas and oil in Russia, in addition to being the richest names in Russia. They have, however, earned Putin's wrath by resisting Russia's recent, unpredictable breakthroughs. This has recently demonstrated how much Putin supports an anti-democratic type of government. It makes no difference if you are a high-ranking Russian official, if you are not a Putin admirer, but if Putin believes in you, he can promote even the most ordinary citizen to the highest levels of power. The Russian people who are aware of the situation now want to be managed by meritocratic leaders. This internal disarray is expected to worsen with Putin's departure. It is one of the ideas that the war will change in every way after Putin goes. Your Kremlin is in disarray. The Russian army was brought to an end due to a lack of Russian intelligence, and the surprise offensive of the Ukrainian army resulted in the departure of the Russian army and the admission of two high-ranking officials known as Putin's most faithful men into each other. With a new army of 10,000 soldiers, the Ukrainian army is pushing on Kharkiv. The massive onslaught launched by the Ukrainian army on Kharkiv made life difficult for the occupying Russian forces. The Ukrainian army has expanded weapons shipments to the cities of Izium and Kupiansk, which it has just liberated from Russian domination. Although Russian forces assume that these military shipments were for the city of Solidar, Ukraine's main purpose was to recover Kharkiv. The Ukrainian army has begun marching towards Kharkiv with tanks, armored vehicles, and a new army of 10,000 people amassed in the cities of Izium and Kupiansk. In recent months, the Ukrainian army was able to retake the captured cities of Izium and Kupiansk, and it announced that its next target was Kharkiv. It is planned to expel the occupying Russian troops from Kharkiv in conjunction with the massive onslaught conducted by the Ukrainian army. Ukrainian soldiers moving to Malinovka, which is under Russian army control, have pinned down the Russian forces. After hours of fighting, the Ukrainian army forced the occupying Russian troops in Malinovka to retreat. According to regional reports, 32 Russian servicemen were killed in battles in the city of Malinovka alone. Following the capture of Malinovka, the Ukrainian army advanced on Chigoev, which is closer to Kharkiv. The skirmishes, which began in the early hours of the morning, are claimed to be ongoing, and a considerable number of Russian soldiers have been killed. The Ukrainian army, which is carrying out airstrikes and artillery fire on the city of Chuhuv, is attempting to push Russian troops out of the buildings where they are sheltering. If the Ukrainian army, which is simultaneously fighting Russian soldiers in Chuhuv, captures the city, the vast majority of the Kharkiv region will be under Ukrainian control. Ukrainian commanders in the battle's zone said they were attempting to reach the city of Chuhuv with a very crowded force and that a large number of Russian soldiers were killed during the clashes. According to reports, the Russian army lost the great bulk of its troops in Chuhuv. Over 500 Russian soldiers are thought to have died in the conflict. The Russian General Staff Chief Valery Gerasimov, who is in command of Russian soldiers on Ukrainian soil, has directed many of his troops in Russia to the Kharkiv region in order to avoid losing the Kharkiv region. Gerasimov stated that tens of thousands of Russian soldiers are stationed near the Belgorod border and will be transferred to the Kharkiv region. The Russian army's forced retreat from Malinovka is viewed as Gerasimov's failure by the Russian leadership. Russian troops caught off guard by the Ukrainian army's advance are on the verge of losing Kharkiv. Ukraine's ground operation in Kharkiv has raised significant problems within the Kremlin. Putin, who called an emergency meeting in the early morning, summoned Russian authorities to the Kremlin. During the meeting, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and General Staff Chief Valery Gerasimov apparently had verbal spats. Gerasimov, according to Shoigu, was the sole reason for the Russian army's collapse on Ukrainian soil. Shoigu was furious that the Russian soldiers had failed so miserably in Kharkiv following their defeat in Solidar. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu stated that Valery Gerasimov, commander of the Russian army, is to blame for Russia's failure to notify the Ukrainian army of a new offensive. The fundamental cause for the absence of intelligence, according to General Staff Chief Gerasimov, is Putin and robbery. According to Gerasimov, the vast majority of soldiers stationed in the Kharkiv region are recruits who were recruited into the army through the partial mobilization decision, and these soldiers have no knowledge of the war. According to Gerasimov, the recruits dispatched to the battlefield as a result of the mobilization decision do more harm than good to the Russian army. Gerasimov added that they have spotter soldiers in several locations of Ukrainian territory, but that owing to a lack of training and shortcomings, these soldiers were unable to acquire intelligence information at the appropriate moment. Gerasimov, who previously asserted that Shoigu and his recruits were mostly responsible for Russia's lack of intelligence, stated that he accepts no responsibility. Gerasimov claimed that Russia has failed numerous times owing to a lack of intelligence, and that Sergei Surovikin, the former commander of Russian military, has repeatedly complained about the same lack of intelligence. Gerasimov, who stated that the Russian Defense Ministry was the primary source of their intelligence problems, blamed Shoigu for this failure. Gerasimov, who stated that they should not blame the Russian army, stated that Russian officers on Ukrainian soil have frequently highlighted concerns about intelligence. According to Gerasimov's words, Russian commanders operating on Ukrainian territory did not receive the essential information support, resulting in the loss of numerous occupied territories. As is well known, the robbery was one of the names that backed Putin's decision to conduct a partial mobilization. Gerasimov was one of the names forced to comply with the partial mobilization decision. This is also the basis for the ongoing deceleration of tensions between the robbery and Gerasimov. Putin, Russia's president, has earlier fired General Sergei Surovikin out of fear. So what made Putin fearful of his Surovikin? Because of the failures in Ukraine, Putin was continuously changing the commander at the helm of the Russian army. But this was not the primary reason for Sergei Surovikin's removal. Sergei Surovikin, the former commander of the Russian army on Ukrainian territory, has claimed numerous times that Russia has intelligence problems and has been unable to offer the necessary intelligence support. Furthermore, Surovikin indicated that the main cause for the Russian army's failure in Ukraine was a lack of intelligence, and he was eventually fired as a result of his failings in Ukraine. Many Russian insiders believe Putin is seeking for a pretext to fire Sergei Surovikin. Sergei Surovikin had put immense pressure on the Russian army and dominated the whole force when he gained office. Furthermore, he has taken control of nearly the whole Russian army, as well as dispatching Russian forces with whom he had previously battled on Syrian land to Ukraine. We will not be making a misleading remark if we declare that Russian soldiers virtually worshipped Sergei Surovikin. This made Putin quite uneasy. Sergei Surovikin's meteoric rise and the fact that he amassed so much influence in such a short period of time posed a challenge to Putin. Surovikin, who had assumed complete control of the Russian army, was also beginning to frighten Putin. Russian President Vladimir Putin sacked Sergei Surovikin, claiming failures on the battlefield as an excuse to ensure his own kingdom. Instead of Surovikin, he rehired Valery Gerasimov, whom he could easily control and with whom he had previously worked for many years. Sergei Surovikin is a commander who is well known for war crimes and brutal actions on the battlefield. When Putin appointed Surovikin, he put himself in danger of committing war crimes on Ukrainian land. Putin, believing that Surovikin would allow him to more easily attack Ukrainian territory, delegated full command of the Russian army to him. Surovikin launched an attack on Kiev, Ukraine's capital, as soon as he seized power. Surovikin, who launched an airstrike on Kiev, was expected to take a hard position in Ukraine. Surovikin's drive for increased power, however, alarmed Putin, leading to his resignation. The Russians in Crimea have been dealt a devastating blow with this maneuver. The Ukrainian army was able to drive the Russians out of the area. Russia's hands have been restricted by this ridiculous operation in Crimea. Ukraine now controls the most important military HQ in the region. Following that, the Ukrainian army has effectively surrounded Russia. The Ukrainian army began to establish a significant advantage in the final days of the Ukrainian war. The fundamental cause for this dominance, however, is Ukraine's extraordinary success. As the Ukrainian army advanced, Russia's plans became increasingly twisted. However, Zelensky has often stated how sensitive he is on one subject. Crimea was another name for this region. Ukraine's President Zelensky began taking efforts in 2014 to end Russia's illegitimate annexation of Crimea. Along with these actions, Ukraine underlined its concern regarding Crimea, but Putin has declined to take any action in response to this occurrence. As a result, the Ukrainian army began to consider the solution as coordinating specific operations in Crimea. The initial goal of these operations was to blow up the Kerch Bridge, which connected Russia and Crimea. This explosion sent shock waves around the world. It was a significant hint of what Zelensky, who wants Crimea to come into Ukrainian hands, is capable of. Following it, numerous operations in Crimea were organized, but the most crucial aspect of these actions was the Crimean people's unwavering support. The Russian army's actions in Crimea shocked the entire globe. The Ukrainian military has begun contacting opposition groups, mainly those in Crimea. The Fire Group was the first of these groups, and it caused havoc among the Russian forces in this region. With their protestations, this mob was constantly encircling Russian forces because the Ukrainian army is aware of this. It has begun speaking with representatives of the firing organization in order to gather intelligence. As a result of these discussions, it was discovered that Russia retains dominance in this region due to an active military headquarters. The Ukrainian army then started to arrange an attack on this military command. This was the starting point for Ukraine's historic operation in Crimea. The Ukrainian army has deployed troops in Crimea to challenge Russia's grip in the peninsula. The aforementioned military headquarters was discovered to be in Simferopol. The most essential aspect of its headquarters was that it offered ammunition and vehicle aid to all of the forces in Crimea. The supremacy in Crimea was maintained by these aids. However, after determining the magnitude of the damage that would be caused here, the Ukrainian army decided to send a group of special forces to this territory. The Ukrainian special forces had decided to blow up this headquarters after arriving in this territory from behind the predetermined coordinates. However, the Ukrainian army would be unable to carry out a full operation due to fierce battles in Bakhmut and Soledar. As a result, the Ukrainian special forces decided to seek assistance from the firing group based on the mission. The firing group has taken steps to capitalize on the several advantages that the Ukrainian army will receive. He decided to approach the Russian army while there were several Crimeans around the firing group. This organization was only going to cause trouble in organized protests. The Ukrainian special forces would also detonate a massive blast at the decommissioned headquarters. Protests in this area were begun by the fire group. When the Russian local law enforcement forces were unable to interfere, he opted to deploy the army. A big number of soldiers from the Vital Command arrived in the region in this area. Ukrainian special forces were ambushed with the departure of the Russian soldiers. He decided to infiltrate the headquarters covertly, but now was the time to literally corner the Russian troops. Ukrainian forces have begun laying a big quantity of explosives in the vicinity of munition stockpiles. The explosives placed in the portion where the bombs were located in particular would intensify the force of the explosion. The Ukrainian army opted to surround the Russian soldiers. Ukrainian special forces moved out of the area after informing the firing group. The Ukrainian army used remote-controlled explosives to destroy the military headquarters. Following that, the Russian forces were taken aback by the consequences of the explosion. The most important military headquarters had been destroyed. The Crimean fire group, on the other hand, dissolved and vanished almost soon. As a result, the Russian soldiers were taken aback by what they had to undertake. The commander of the headquarters who alerted the Kremlin was removed from his position. Putin was furious about this. In Crimea, he imposed a state of emergency. Following that, the Russian army has entered a difficult era. With this tragedy, many Crimeans began to rise up against Putin's forces. This move has highlighted the problems that Putin will face, according to military specialists. Russia's authority in Crimea has been severely undermined by this action. And with the erosion of this authority, Russia's grasp on Crimea has grown increasingly difficult. Although Putin has made attempts to repair his wounds in this region, the region's residents are concerned about Russia's failure to safeguard even its own borders. The fact that the Russian army had fallen into such a weak position as a result startled the entire globe. About 30 years ago, the Russian army was regarded as one of the most powerful in the world. But with Putin's election to the presidency, everything changed. Putin began to undermine the Russian army because he saw that his administration was fragile. The fundamental reason for this was the threat of a coup. Putin feared a coup in Russia, which he knew was ruling badly and brutally. As a result, the Russians have never allowed the forces to become adequately powerful. Furthermore, he decided to fire those generals whose names had previously been invoked by the coup. Despite their accomplishments, these generals were not in a position to stage a coup in Russia. When Putin began to have doubts, he began to take procedures that would lead to the disbandment of the Russian army. Many distinguished generals began to face challenges as a result of this. Sergei Surovikin, who has served in the Russian army for a long time and is highly accomplished, is at the top of the list. Putin's dismissal of a highly rated general in Russia stunned the entire world, not just in operations in Russia. This general, who has also excelled in numerous cross-border missions, is one of the most successful characters in the Russian army. But in addition to his success, he was gaining attention because he was a member of the gang plotting a coup against the Soviet Union. As a result, everyone in the Russian army suspected of plotting a coup was jailed or assigned to alternative assignments. This prepared the door for the Russian army to deteriorate day by day because of Putin's actions. The Russian army has begun to face significant difficulties. If Putin continues in this manner, there will be no fighters in the army. This will prepare the way for the Russian army, which has suffered a massive failure in the Ukrainian war, to become more and more ineffective by the day. However, the remarks of war analysts on this subject have reverberated all over the world. According to military observers, the Russian army's weakness may open the door for it to be threatened by other countries. Russia may become significantly weaker as a result, notwithstanding its regional dominance. If Russia falls into this situation, it will be impossible for it to achieve even a minor success. This victory, which could not be achieved against Ukraine, is poised to plunge Russia into a deeper catastrophe. An ambush from Ukraine has changed the direction of the conflict. The Russian soldiers were taken aback by what they had to undertake. Ukraine's recent move has truly driven Putin insane with nerves. After that, everything changed in Ukraine's favor, and the Russian army was forced to withdraw from certain location. However, the facts of this unbelievable operation have astounded the entire world. Many achievements of the Ukrainian army were made in the final days of the Russian-Ukrainian war. If they continue, Putin's authority will be entirely undermined. This will lay the groundwork for the emergence of major problems because of the Russian army's actions. Ukraine has now taken measures to make a move that will change things. This has now enabled the Ukrainian army to perform the most vital move. Russia has recently concentrated its efforts on two areas. One of them is Bakhmut, which is dominated by the Ukrainian army, while the other is Sadr. It is not by chance that the Russian army gravitates towards these territories as a result of successive combat losses in these regions. When the Ukrainian army caused repeated damage to the forces in this region with its breakthroughs in recent days, Putin chose to launch a completely different attack. However, this attack would affect the mentality of the Ukrainian army in many locations right now. The Russian army is extremely concerned that the Ukrainian army may make measures to entirely expel Russians from the country in light of recent developments. But as recent developments have proven, the fact that Ukraine will now strike a significant blow to the Russians has changed everything. You may help our team by clicking the super thank you button, which has been trying to provide you with the most accurate information since the beginning of the battle. The Ukrainian army's potential to attack has increased as a result of the support it has received in recent days. However, Ukraine's numerous advantages allowed the Russian soldiers to be surrounded. Russian soldiers began to retreat or seek methods to flee the army as a result of the Ukrainian army's significantly harder moves in specific places currently. However, it is now clear that the development of Ukraine's intelligence has grave concerns. Ounces has grave consequences. According to the most recent information gathered by Ukrainian intelligence, the Russian army has discovered that an operation against Solidar will be conducted in the near future. On top of that, the Ukrainian army began to literally corner the Russians by directing artillery towards the sector. The Ukrainian army's actions in this area were designed to constantly catch the Russians off guard. The Ukrainian army retreated from Solidar as a result of this. In response to this unexpected move, the Russian army declared that it had taken Sadr. But when Ukraine's ridiculous plan was revealed, the Russians were taken aback. The departure of Ukraine from Sadr put the Russian forces in a good mood because they hadn't had a victory in a long time. Following that, the fact that Ukraine appeared straight on solid earth caught the Russians entirely off guard. The ambushed Russian forces were astonished where to flee as a result of this step. Following that, the Ukrainian soldiers that went on the offensive began to drive the Russians out of Solidar. However, the Russian army is believed to have retreated from several districts of Solidar because of this unprecedented attack on Ukraine. Russia is now effectively surrounded in several locations. If this trend continues, the groundwork will be laid for Ukrainian soldiers to take more harsh measures. However, the fact that Putin signed two quite different decisions following the operation changed everything because of the recent failures. Russian President Vladimir Putin has found himself in a position where he isn't sure what to do. Following that, Putin's confrontational policies have begun to move things in a different direction. Many countries have begun to protest Putin's actions, which include repeated threats to drive the world into nuclear war in the face of global backing. This demonstrated how much Putin's international relations, which have been politically paralyzed, have deteriorated following this. With Poland's key action, the Ukrainian army is now in a position to achieve success in all sectors. This key maneuver has further demoralized the Russian troops in all sectors. Poland and Slovakia are two countries that back Ukraine. The significance of this Polish fighter jet maneuver in terms of support will perplex the entire world since the Ukrainian army has surrounded the Russians. It is believed that the Russian army, together with these allies, will now shift to high-level protection, even in Moscow. However, the type of the help provided to Poland is of critical importance on this premise. When the Polish army begins to provide assistance to Ukraine, a large number of Western countries rally behind it. Furthermore, the entire world is aware that Poland, which delivered the initial tank support to Ukraine, made key actions in several regions of the fight. As a result, the world has been perplexed as to why Poland is concerned about its own security in the region. It is well known that Poland believes that the regional power balance should be altered in several of these locations. The question of what Ukraine will do has begun to shift in recent days. Poland is well aware that Russia has new objectives in this region. Although Ukraine is Russia's primary objective, it intends to extend the occupation period to other areas as well. This was discovered after hard work by Ukrainian and Israeli intelligence. Due to the fact that several nations in the right bloc are moving to join the Western Bloc. Russia has begun to take steps to these territories. The mobilization of Ukrainian troops in this region has been seen as the tipping moment that will halt Russia's progress in Europe in several regions. The assistance provided to Ukraine in this region is crucial if the Ukrainian army does not surrender in this region. The Russian army will be unable to advance. Ukrainian intelligence identified one of Russia's latest targets. This new goal has sparked widespread concern around the world. Ukraine's actions in recent days have begun to show in all areas. Its advancement in intelligence in particular has laid the groundwork for the detection of all Putin's maneuvers. As a result, Ukrainian military have been able to organize very successful missions in a very short period of time. Furthermore, the Ukrainian army have reached the stage when they will make attempts to win the battle. The Ukrainian army has recognized Russia's new target as a result of these developments. This goal was registered as Moldova, surprising the entire world. Moldova is one of the eastern countries that has recently moved closer to the West. Moldova wishes to join NATO, as Ukraine does, and to make other measures similar to those made by Ukraine. But he wants to go a step farther and join forces with Romania because this situation will drastically alter the balance of power in the region. Putin has begun to threaten Moldova in reaction. The globe has been astonished by the words of war analysts on this matter. According to war analysts, the actions done by the Ukrainian army for some time appear to have ended Russia's whole power, which is regarded as a regional force. The regional center of power began to shift as a result of the success of blows delivered by Ukrainian forces to Russia. As a result, many of the countries surrounding Russia began to change sides and turn against Russia. The Eastern Bloc, which recognizes the West's dominance in many areas, has moved to retaliate against Russia in every way. One of the most prominent instances is Ukraine's recent breakthroughs. Russia is no longer seen as a safe haven for investors or governments in the region. As a result, the Ukrainian army's recent actions will change everything, and each action done against Russian forces will entirely demolish Russia's regional influence. However, at this moment, it is possible to conclude that the Russian force is currently alone and in a major jam. Another thing that will be jeopardized by Ukraine's win is that Russia's power struggle may escalate into deeper problems. Ukraine's success has the potential to shift global balances. It is unclear what Russia, which will be most affected by this circumstance, will do in collaboration with Putin. If things continue in this manner, it will only be a matter of time before Putin loses power.